Hi, everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm calling in from Beirut. I'm the executive director of afikra, and I'm really excited about today's call with fellow Beiruti, who is also a fellow Brooklynite as well, so that's great. So our special guest is Ramsey Nasser. He is a computer scientist and the creator of Qalb, a programming language. His work includes games, applications, hardware, programming languages, data visualizations, websites, and more. The Qalb programming language is a functional programming language allowing a programmer to write programs completely in Arabic. His work explores the cultural baggage of computing, different kinds of playful spaces, and programming as a medium of self-expression. He holds a BS in computer science from the American University of Beirut and an MFA in design technology from Parsons, the New School for Design, and is a former IBEAM fellow. Ramsey, welcome to afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored and very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited. So I guess I'm really curious to sort of start at the beginning and really think about how you felt about, what was your interaction with computers, computer games as a kid? You know, walk me through when you first started working with, or not working, interacting with computers as a kid.
Yeah, so it's all through my dad, who is not a programmer or anything. He's a lawyer, but dad has always been a tinkerer. He's just always interested in like just gadgets and technology in general. As an example, even before I was born, in the early 80s, he got his hands on a very advanced, on a Canon A1, if anyone does photography. It's like a very advanced, it was one of the first sort of slightly computerized manual cameras at the time. And he like wasn't a photographer. He's just interested in like, you know, oh, this is the bleeding edge of something. And he would sort of throw himself into these fields and play around with them. Similarly, by the late 80s, when I was a kid, I had, because of my dad and his hobbies, the privilege of growing up in a household with an IBM computer, which was, we were in Istanbul for a little while and then in Southern California for a little while, but there's just always been computers sort of in my childhood. And my dad was teaching himself how to program in BASIC just because he was just curious. And yeah, my earliest memories of interacting with a computer are basically sitting on my dad's lap while he was he had like a printed BASIC manual on one side and teaching himself how to program. And we lived in Istanbul for a long time. I was exposed to the modern Turkish, which I was fluent in for a while, and I've since forgotten. And I also, of course, knew Arabic, which is my first language. And to my mind, at the time, there were two languages. There was the squiggly one and then the other one. And I saw that in computers, like at the DOS prompt, it's like, oh, it's the other one. It's not the squiggly one. So I have this distinct memory of typing Turkish commands into DOS and hitting enter, like nothing would work because it was expecting English. But yeah, even before I became familiar with the language that is like a prerequisite to do computing, I was just a little kid in the Middle East sitting on his dad's lap watching the program.
This was like 92-ish, 90 or 89.
Yeah, this is like 90, 91. We left Istanbul when I was in like 92 or 93. But yeah. So this is, late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, which is a massive, I mean, people ask me like, what it takes to become a good programmer, and it's just time. And on one hand, that's simple, right? But it's also like having time with a computer is an enormous privilege. And my time, the clock started basically when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and it's never stopped.
So right before the call, we were talking a little bit about your decision to go from electrical engineering to go into computer science. Are you equally drawn towards software and hardware? Were you sort of a tinkerer in the way that you wanted to take out the motherboard and understand that stuff? Or were you really, really interested in sort of programming software stuff?
Yeah, no, I did a lot of hardware stuff, and I occasionally do that. I did a lot of that at Parsons as well, and I occasionally do that now. So I think that, but there is I'm much more interested in software, and I've spent much more of my time in software. And I think the difference is like less one of interest or curiosity, and more one of like laziness. So software has this allure and is hypnotic because you can have an idea and see it in like 15 minutes. And I almost like, even now as an adult, I need to sort of like be mindful of the fact that like some things take time, and like I get frustrated when I can't like make a thing in one sitting. It's like no, sometimes it takes a couple of days. It's okay. But in hardware, I mean, I have friends who fabricate chips, and they do like all kinds of like custom circuit boards and stuff. And you might have an idea, and it'll take 2 weeks to like round trip it and try it out. And certainly when you're a kid, you just like know hardware is like you could just sort of mix and match stuff that you find lying around. So I think the really tight turnaround time between like idea and feedback, or it's like almost like question and answer, is really what drew me into software. And yeah, that's definitely what took me out of electrical engineering, which is what I did my first year at AUB, and into computer science, where you could just try stuff out, and it's like low stakes, and it's very, very quick.
So I want to sort of get into some of the, I'll save Qalb for a little later, and sort of I have a bunch of questions about that process. Yeah. But I'm curious about this idea of, programming and social justice, or programming and activism, and thinking about, thinking about that period. Yeah. Do you remember when you started to really like pull back the veil and say, wait a second, this is A, maybe a tool for social justice, and B, this needs to be looked, this whole practice needs to be examined through that lens for injustice?
Yeah, it was, I mean, in a lot of ways it was Parsons, and it was an education in art that, I mean, really, like, I think liberated me in a sense. AUB was an absolutely wonderful program, and I wouldn't be half the developer I am today without the education that I got there. But it was well, no, and AUB, they force you to take, I mean, it's not like a hardcore STEM program like you have in a lot of some schools in America. I mean, AUB had requirements that you take classes in like, civilization sequence and history and philosophy. And I hated them at the time, but they were absolutely crucial to my intellectual development, and I'm very grateful for them. But, having been educated in computer science, you get this hammer, and you really want to turn everything into a nail. It's like, oh, I'm good at this one thing. I get rewarded for this one thing. It has this very like dopamine sort of feedback loop. And you see it in a lot of like tech people who just are convinced that software exclusively is the solution to all problems, and software itself is objective and like neutral and like can do no wrong. And it's couldn't be further from the truth. So I didn't really start to unpack that until I was at Parsons, and then through IBM, which is the art fellowship that I did a year like right out of Parsons, which is where I made Qalb. So it was a 3-year process, basically, of like looking back on my education as a computer scientist and like realizing that it's a tool like any other tool, and it's not, it can do certain things in an interesting way, but it like on its own is not liberatory. It like needs to work in concert with other things, and definitely needs to be sort of dissected and analyzed.
Yeah. So let's talk about Qalb for a second. So just with like a little more inside baseball, a level of granularity than maybe is normal, walk through some of the challenges that you encountered trying to develop this language that you didn't expect. I'm sure like from the jump, on a back of an envelope, you're like, oh, this is going to be hard, this is going to be hard, this is going to be hard, this is going to be easy, this is going to be easy. Well, what didn't make that list that you're like, whoa, I had no idea?
Yeah, no, that's a great way of asking it. In a lot of ways, I approached Qalb as engineering performance art, if that's a way of calling it. Like I wanted to, it's really important that Qalb is not speculative. Like I did the thing, to answer exactly the questions that you're asking. It's like, wait, where do things break? Some things that really surprised me. So Elb is hosted on GitHub, which is the standard, a very common place where open source projects are hosted. The URL for Elb is not github.com/Nasser/Elb. It's github.com/Nasser/-hyphen. Because GitHub, it's not really anywhere in the documentation, but if you try and name your project using letters that are not Latin, they just won't do it. They'll turn them all into hyphens. So Qaf Lam Ba becomes hyphen. That kind of surprised me. Every text editor failed at editing Arabic text coherently, which didn't surprise me, but they all failed in different ways, which baffled my mind. Like some of them didn't join the characters, but other than that, it was all laid out nicely. Some of them joined the characters, but it was like left aligned, and then the English and Arabic, and then the punctuation was all inverted. So I actually needed to use 3 or 4 different text editors that were all broken in different ways, but between them, I could like sort of write code in Arabic. So like the spacing in Sublime Text worked okay, but then if I actually had to like, type out letters, I would use this other like text editor. I expected the text editing experience to be broken, but the like lack of consistency was like completely surprising.
And so, okay, I have a bunch of questions. It's supposed to be sort of engineering performance art. What were you sort of, for lack of a better term, unhappy with in terms of by the end of it, you're like, there's still new things I want to do, but because of the time limitations and I got to get this out there. And it's not something that can just stay in the garage forever. I need to show people this thing.
Yeah, I mean, the calligraphy piece, that tile mosaic piece that's on the slide was part of the final year show that Elb was in. It's like, and so I very much did have a deadline that I had to meet.
Yeah.
For the most part, I think Elb itself, I kind of got to where I wanted it to get to. It answered the question of like, why is it so hard to program in languages that aren't English? And it serves as a foundation for like later work that I did sort of on top of that question. I'm trying to think if there's anything that was cut. There were a bunch of bugs in the interpreter that I just didn't have time to fix, that I was just ready to like, I'm just gonna go to the show and like whatever. But the next morning I had like another Arab programmer who I like met online fixed all my bugs. His name is Amjad Masad, and he's the founder of Replit, which is like a website where you can like learn programming and like do like programming stuff. So like open source and like Arab solidarity, I think saved me in the end. But yeah, I was ready to go to show with like a bunch of bugs that I would have been quite unhappy with.
There's like in the last 10 years, there's been this like plethora of like GUI based learn how to code apps and stuff like that, like drag and drop, teaching 5-year-olds to quote unquote code, right?
Yeah.
Teaching logical, sort of the logic of code. Have you been approached by Arabic speaking app developers who are like, hey, we want to basically use Qalb in this type of environment?
I get an email. So Qalb, the final show that Qalb, or the first show that Qalb was in was 2013. And I've deliberately not pushed any code to the project since, because to my mind, it's finished and that chapter is done. And I'm like, it's the foundation for other things, but the project itself is finished. So 2013, so it's been 8 years, right? I get an email from an Arab developer probably once every couple of months asking what you just basically said in some form or another. And it's almost, and I'm obviously very grateful for it. And like, people are basically like excited about the project and ask me like, how can I use this in my thing? Or how can I build on this? Or how can I, but I kind of feel like I'm stuck in a time loop where I just have to like disappoint people consistently every couple of months. And I have to say the same spiel of like, oh, it turns out that because of the ecosystem of software that's available, it's all written in English. You actually can't ever have a coherent all Arabic programming experience. It'll always be limited. And I could sort of get into why if that's helpful, but yeah, well, it'll just never be on par with what the English experience is. And it's not my goal to build an Arabic programming experience. And like Qalb isn't really about the Arabic language. It's about like non-English languages, right? So yeah, every couple of months I have to, I mean, no exaggeration, just a couple of days ago, I sent an email to someone being like, yeah, you could build on it if you wanted to. I mean, it's not a bad idea, but you need to understand that there is a real limitation to like how robust this could ever be, right? You're always going to be a couple of steps behind real programming, which is done in American English.
So in places like, in India and China, they are all also using Latin script?
Oh yeah, no, without exception, everywhere on the planet.
And is that because of like compilers and hardware at the end of the day?
It's a couple of things. Historically, yeah, compilers like the C compiler, for example, will not allow you to name your local identifiers in anything but Latin. It's annoying, but you can get over that. And many modern languages don't actually have that restriction. So in JavaScript, you can actually name your functions in Arabic. Like you can do that. That's one problem. Another problem is keywords. So like a lot of languages have built-in words that you have to use. So in JavaScript, the way you create a function is the word function, F-U-N-C-T-I-O-N. And if the compiler or interpreter doesn't see that sequence of characters, it's not going to know that it's a function. So you have the naming of your variables and stuff, and also the keywords historically have been forced to be English. That's surmountable. Like Qalb, gets past all that. So the real problem though is the names that other people use in libraries, in SDKs, in APIs, and modern software is only possible by building on other people's software. And because of the way programming languages work, to use someone else's software, you have to use the actual names that they used for their functions and their data. So you're kind of forced into a linguistic collaboration with people you've never met. And all the libraries are in English. If you want to do iOS development, you have to call functions on the phone, and those functions have English names. So you're either translating from English into your language, in which case you're a second-class citizen, or you have your programming language in your native language, but it has English words in it. So really the thing that actually makes it formally impossible is the prevalence of English language libraries that you have to build on.
So as an educator, as somebody who's going, like we were talking about workshops for students, and is this basically, do you feel like when you say this project is done, the idea is hey, I'm pointing out the atrocities, I'm pointing out that these tools we're using aren't transparent, they're not natural tools, they're man-made or human-made, and we have to acknowledge that? Or is there, you are essentially trying to pass the ball to somebody else, hoping somebody else does blank?
No. So I have, there are further steps beyond Qalb. In 2019, I gave a talk on what I thought an alternative might look like. And like I said, I'm not interested, even if something like Qalb were possible, it's not a worthwhile goal for me to add one more programming language to the pantheon, because that doesn't do anything for Tamil programmers, right? It's just as bad. So I have a sketch of a programming system where basically things don't have names. Everyone can basically maintain a local dictionary of names for things. And in the same way that a table is both a table and a tawle, and the world doesn't end, and Arabs aren't forced to call tables tables, and English speakers aren't forced to call them tawles. We need to bring something like that into programming, such that I can call things what I want to call them, you can call the things what you want to call them, and then, but still on the technical level, everything really doesn't have a name, so it all kind of works. But as a programming language, it looks unrecognizable. It's just completely different. Which is, I think, natural. Like if we want something radically different from a programming experience where one written culture has hegemony over everyone else, it's going to look very different from what we currently have. So that's what I'm interested in. I mean, I'm mortal, I have a finite lifespan, and all this stuff is going to take time. That as an end goal is more, I think, worthwhile of putting time into, to figuring out what does a programming experience that doesn't privilege any written culture look like, as opposed to let's make Arabic programming work. Which is not to say that that's a bad goal. That's just not personally where I'm excited to put my time into.
Yeah, even your language that you're using right now, like you're not saying programming language, you're saying programming experience.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're not interested in a quote unquote language. You're interested in, okay, how do we actually reformat the arena in which people are able to do their work.
Absolutely, because the language is part of it, but then there's documentation, right? Yeah. There's people talking about programming to each other and online. I mean, this came up in the I was involved in the Ruby programming language years ago, not so much anymore. But Ruby was made by a Japanese man, and a lot of the core developers are Japanese, and they don't speak English because why would they? But it's also very popular in the English-speaking world. So there's this like hard linguistic problem of like, how do we talk to each other? Which is, I mean, my perspective on like programming is like the hard problems aren't technical. Like we can write compilers, we can build stuff, that's fine. Making people who don't speak the same language communicate, that's hard. That's just capital H hard. And like other industries have to deal with this. The airline industry has to deal with this, right? Like a Japanese pilot needs to land in Beirut. They need to communicate. They have guidelines for that. But like these are not technical problems. So yeah, the programming experience is like, sure, there's a language and there's going to be a compiler or an interpreter. But what are we doing about documentation? How are we doing community? How are communities communicating with each other? And sort of like, expanding out from there.
I'm curious, like it's funny how like certain professions get termed differently over time. Like I feel like as a kid, I never heard the word an entrepreneur, but in Lebanon, every single person works in a family business, but none of them used to be called entrepreneurs, but everybody is basically an entrepreneur, right. But that term was like not in vogue. Similarly, I feel like the word developer became in vogue, I don't know, in the sort of 2000s-ish. And before they were called computer scientists or programmers and stuff like that. And there's a whole generation of these computer scientists and programmers that, learn BASIC and learn that sort of stuff in the 80s and 90s in the Arab world. And many of them don't speak English, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious if you sort of have had access to these types of folks and gotten a sense of their experience, and if they've commented on your work and had anything to say, like what was the reception from that generation of programmers?
Yeah, those are some of my favorite conversations that have come out of the Qalb project. Basically, it's broadly speaking, there's like two categories. There's people who just manipulated opaque symbols and just sort of glued them together in a way that made computers do things. And like, it didn't matter that it said if or while or like, it's just some stuff, right? It's just opaque magic. I taught at Pratt a couple of years ago, and my best programmer was a student whose proficiency in English was very, very slim. He was from mainland China, and his code was basically a big block of a big comment at the start of every file, in Chinese, and then with some like Latin letters inside, and then all of his like the names of his functions and variables were all single letters, which is bad programming style. But as far as he was concerned, it's like, this symbol does this, and like I have that documentation. And he was by far and away the best programmer I had in my class, right? So this is sort of like symbol manipulation. There's a way that people can get by doing that. I would argue, I mean, you're having kind of a worse programming experience than someone who's fluent in the language that the programming language is based on. But a lot of people told me that they learned English to learn to do basic. A lot of non-Arabs too. A couple of Russian programmers reached out to me who grew up in the Soviet Union, and there were Cyrillic programming languages in the Soviet Union, but BASIC was also very popular. And a lot of people said, like, my first exposure to the English language was BASIC, and I sort of started teaching myself English to get better at BASIC. And that's kind of what's at the heart of this work, is that programming, which gets talked about as this like neutral, acultural thing, is a vehicle for the American English language. And it has like helped that language spread around the world. And like, we need to think about that from, a political and cultural perspective.
Yeah, maybe a good analogy for what you're thinking of is basically like musical notation, right?
Right.
Where you're saying, these are going to be symbols. This means legato in every single culture, right? Or, I mean, that's actually not true, but it can be understood in every single culture, like independent of any spoken language or reading or writing. Okay.
Yeah. And I think programming gets talked about as if it's music, and even musical notation has Italian words in it sometimes, but the core of it is completely symbolic. And programming gets talked about that way, and it's not, it's words, right? It's just like, it's carefully chosen words.
So I want to talk a little bit about moving away from Qalb. There was going to be tons of questions in the chat about it, but some of your projects on your website, and I encourage anybody looking or listening later on to check out the website. These are fun, right? Or maybe they're funny, right? But these all have some sort of socio-political undercurrent that you're trying to sort of explore. Can you talk through restricted airspace, which is what we're looking at right now, what this project was and sort of what you got out of it?
Yeah, so Restricted Airspace is a game I made there's a bar in Brooklyn called Wonderville that was getting started, and it's a bar with arcade machines that only shows independent games, if that makes sense. And independent games is basically like people like me making games, like sort of non-commercially. They get sold as well, but like it's basically not Nintendo is sort of like the definition, right? And Restricted Airspace was made as a Kickstarter reward to help the arcade start. It's a combination of like two things that were a big part of my childhood, which is the video game Star Fox, which is from the early 90s. It's a Super Nintendo game with like lo-fi, low color graphics about sort of flying through space and like fighting bad guys. But also like, the architecture of Beirut and like pictures that I grew up with of Beirut and Damascus in the 1890s. That's the sort of like the mood board for this was that. And like the Ferris wheel in the corner is the Luna Park from Beirut. I mean, so it's just like, write what you know. And in a sense, I'm very interested in like, my identity as an Arab person and as a Lebanese person, but also I grew up playing video games. And it's like, I so often those two sort of modes of my existence are siloed off. And this is an attempt to do more of both of them at the same time. It's like, I want lo-fi Super Nintendo style video games that take place in Beirut in the 1890s. And that is not a visual I'd ever been exposed to, so I just made it.
It's so funny because when I see Beirut, Damascus in the 1890s, for me, it's like otherworldly, right? But if you told me that like, we're going to play Oregon Trail,
yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, totally. That's not otherworldly. That is, or if you told me we were going to play some Western-based game that takes place in like modern day Tucson in the 1860s, it would be, I know those images, like that's so, that is a world that I can sort of wallpaper that pretty easily, but this is really, really interesting, has an interesting effect.
Yeah. There's a sense of the like visual vocabulary we grew up with, and the like, what visual artifacts are we leaving behind for like the current and next generation? And I definitely want, late Ottoman Levant with like sci-fi elements. Like I want that, and so I'm just gonna make it if I can and if I have to.
Okay, let's talk about this project. I don't think I can pronounce the name. What is the name?
Handväska is the...
Handväska.
Yeah.
So which you describe as an over-the-top, super fast, physics-based, anti-fascist first-person shooter. What is an anti-fascist first-person shooter?
So this was made in the Global Game Jam in 2017. This is right after Trump was elected. And the idea was, it's inspired by this real photo on the left by a woman named Danuta Danielson, moments before like smashing a neo-Nazi on the head with her purse. I thought this photo was from like the 40s. It's from 1985. It's not from olden times, which is sort of haunting. And I think that's it's in Sweden.
I feel like it could be from 2020. So
it could be from like yesterday. Yeah, with like a cool Instagram filter. Yeah, I mean, Trump had just been elected. American fascism was on the rise in a very real way. We wanted to make a game that was basically, inspired by this photo where you like sneak up on a rally of these fake fascists with the like asterisk symbol that we just made up. And you hit them with your purse, just like the Danuta Danielson. And the city is designed like a pinball. I developed this with Jane Friedhoff, who's an incredible game designer and a good friend of mine. And she designed the city like a pinball board. So they just go bouncing off all the walls and you just like accumulate a bunch of points.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, and then the game in the bottom right is a response to the response to Handväska. That's Dialogue 3D. It's a different game. Americans have a weird relationship, I think, with people got very sort of touchy about like, oh, this game is very violent. But it's like, it's video games, y'all. Like this is all we do. So Dialogue 3D is a mod of Wolfenstein 3D, which is the first person shooter, which was a game about shooting Nazis. But before you shoot a Nazi, it asks you like American liberal ethical question, and then you get shot to death.
Very, very, very good. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about how you see sort of the moral responsibility of ethical programming and sort of educating properly. There is this, a wave of learn to code in 3 months, become a super rich developer at Google and Facebook. And that's happening in the region too, right? There's tons of programs that are popping up in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria, trying to empower young adults to make money in the tech world, right? And who can blame them? How do you view yourself in that as a voice in that conversation?
Yeah, that's tricky. It's hard because I mean, with economies collapsing, left, right, and center, it's the rational move is to like do whatever pays well. But on the other hand, I think if I picked a winning lottery ticket when I was a kid, and I got excited about programming, and it was years later that I realized someone might one day pay me money to do it. And now people pay my rent because I can, write software. But it was basically dumb luck that got me into that. But I think to become a good programmer, you have to come at it curiously and like asking weird, dumb questions, and always be asking weird and dumb questions. And it takes a long time. If you're getting into it just as an economic, basically a way to advance economically, you could probably get a job in 3 or 4 months. But I worry that the kind of a programmer you're being trained to become might like set up a ceiling on like how far you can get in that field, if that makes sense. It's not a I think it's that. Like I worry sometimes, and I taught a cohort at General Assembly, which is one of these 3 months get a job, and they really do it. People do get hired pretty consistently.
Yeah, but, I taught at GA too. It's yeah.
No, and they're very serious about getting people hired, and but yeah, it's vocational training, and which is completely fine and very valid, and it pays well. But yeah, I would encourage people to like Yeah, I even worry about, like, I don't know if I'm phrasing it right, that I'm encouraging people, but like that's the thing that I worry is missing, is a sort of like constant curiosity and like a desire to keep learning, because like whatever framework you're going to learn this year is going to be obsolete next year. I guarantee you. 100% of the stuff I learned at AUB, like as tools, are like completely like just evaporated, right? I was doing PHP and jQuery when I was at P. And if anyone is like writing code, they'll like understand like it's like basically Bronze Age stuff. And like I'm always teaching myself new languages and new frameworks, and that's a hard prerequisite of like not just doing this work, but continuing to do this work 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, if that's what you want. So I would worry that in a rapid program that would go missing. But you could, that's something you could sort of like reclaim on your own afterwards, I think.
And what's tricky is that the communities that are drawn towards this vocational training are usually communities that don't have the luxury of second chances.
Yeah.
And so not only does their skills become outdated, they themselves become outdated. And so if we don't like instill this idea of like, hey, you need to actually be training your mind and approaching this for the marathon that is life, instead of 3 months equals, job forever, that's just not the way it's going to go. It's tricky.
No, it's very tricky. And I don't think software development gets thought about or talked about as labor enough. And a lot of software systems are sort of set up to make software laborers interchangeable. So the company that hires you doesn't, like, if you don't keep up with the latest frameworks, they'll just get someone who does. And like, nothing is better than interchangeable labor, I think, to like a big corporation. So yeah, I worry that like the quick vocational schools are creating interchangeable labor, and I don't really know how to course correct for that.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to do a quick Q&A and then open it up to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, what are you reading or watching right now?
I just finished reading The Dispossessed, which I should have read a long time ago. It's really good sci-fi about like sort of thinking about alternate societies. And now I'm reading a lot of political and economic theory, like a lot of Marxist stuff, a lot of like the theory behind what's happening in Rojava and in Kurdistan. I'm really interested in the way they're trying to organize society out there.
Cool. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
So this was the hardest one for me to think of, and I have a specific person and I have a specific day. During the 2006 war, Mazen Kirbaj, who's an architect and a cartoonist, went out on his balcony and recorded a trumpet duet between himself and the IDF dropping bombs on Beirut. And that's just one of the most haunting pieces of art that I've ever sort of been confronted with. And I would love to be a fly on the wall that day and to watch him summon the strength to go out and make art on the balcony, and a balcony in Beirut as Beirut was being bombed.
Where can we watch this art? Is this online somewhere?
Yeah, if you Google Mazen Kirbaj, A Starry Night.
Okay.
It's on his old website. Yeah.
I think that's Mazen Kirbaj. I think this piece of art is
Oh, the one you put in. Yeah.
What do people most misunderstand about your work?
My work is usually not about the thing. It's the thing that I'm putting in front of you is usually like a gateway to something else. So like Qalb is not about Arabic or really Arabic programming. It's about English and about the assumptions that we make about computing. But it's like a puzzle that I like to like let people solve, right? There's something beyond the thing that's in front of you.
Beautifully said. Okay. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
I have no end of admiration for artists who make things with their hands, like illustrators. There's just like, I think because I spend my days editing text files, the idea that you could like draw a thing with your like hands is just absolute magic to me. So I actually have the names of, right. So Sarah Al-Faqih is an illustrator who's enormously talented and active on Twitter. And Christiane Sarkis is a calligrapher who I follow online on Instagram. Makes absolutely beautiful stuff.
Plug for the conversation we did with Christiane. It's really fun if you haven't listened to it.
Super
okay, cool. We're going to start out with Mrkhie.
So I'm an illustrator, and I like to play. I'm a pixel artist, and I'm a budding game artist. So, Anna, what I want is to include Arabic in my art and in my games. So I was really excited to see this topic. Unfortunately, as you said, that the machines or the programs don't really support this. So the questions are two questions. How was it received initially by like game devs? And another question, would you be interested in like organizing or co-organizing an international game dev, like a game jam, um, about Arabic language or Arabic culture or Arab culture?
So to answer those two questions, how is it received? So I maintain a blog on notarabic.com, which is an archive of times in movies and video games that have like messed up Arabic rendering. So I tend to call out game devs a lot for like butchering Arabic online. That's sometimes not received very well. In general, people are when they like learn how much work it takes to support every language besides English, I've found resistance just because it makes the code more complex and it makes the file sizes bigger and stuff. And that's a little disappointing, right? That people just aren't really willing to do the work that it would take to make things more equitable. In terms of organizing a game jam, I'm bad at doing stuff like that. I would love for that to happen. I would love to be involved somehow, but I'm definitely not the person to spearhead it. Rami Ismail is a much more famous game developer than I am, who is he's half Egyptian, half Dutch. And he's been very active in like organizing like international events and educating the games industry about Arabic script, among other things. So Rami would be the person to organize a global like Arabic game jam. I might give him a poke on Twitter about that actually later today. That's a great idea.
Great. Thanks so much for the question. Second question comes from Faye, and I'm supposed to read it. So how high level of a language is Qalb? Is it more like C or more like Python?
Qalb has the exact semantics of a language called Scheme, which is a functional programming language that was taught to like students a lot. It's fairly high level as a result. You're not doing like memory management or any of that kind of stuff that you're doing in C. It's sort of closer to JavaScript in that way.
Okay, great. Our next question, Abdul.
عبد الرحمن.
عبد الرحمن.
مرحبا Ramsey. Well, I'm actually an avid follower of netarabic.com and your entire work. So thanks a lot. It's really inspiring. So yeah, my question actually is very simple, and I think you touched on it quite a bit on the English and being the de facto language for programming and tech in general. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts for people who argue that this achieves universality and that we have, just one language that the entire planet can collaborate and talk with each other versus the diversity, in fact, the lack of grammar as well. And I know that firsthand. Before I know English, I couldn't write any meaningful application.
Yeah.
So what are your take on kind of the future of diverse programming and how you see it's evolving?
Yeah, the universality is not a great argument, honestly. I mean, it's great if you speak English, right? And it's awful if you don't. And that so the average experience across all people is like not great, really, when you think about it. And there are alternatives. I mean, my favorite moment in history that is an alternative is, I didn't know this until recently, but the phrase lingua franca, is used as sort of like a common language, but there was an actual lingua franca, a language that emerged in the Mediterranean that was a mixture of Spanish, Italian, Berber, or Amazigh, sorry, and Arabic. It only existed in port cities, and it basically came into existence because Arab sailors and Italian sailors had to like collaborate and like exchange things. So they just kind of made their own language, right? And that to me is a much more interesting universality, one that like everyone kind of has a say in, as opposed to like a universality which is one culture being imposed on everyone else. That's what I'm more interested in working towards. I have sketches for what that might look like, but I haven't been able to put like meaningful work towards it. I have a talk that I gave in 2019 called "A Personal Computer for Children of All Cultures," which has the description of what that system might look like.
Thanks. Yeah, and how do you see the future? Do you think it's going to be diverse? And
I'm a pessimist. So like I don't mean to be a downer, but I think we're going to be writing C and JavaScript in English for 100 years, unfortunately. This stuff is very, very, very deep, and I want to do work against that grain, but I think it's going to be hard. I mean, there's English code running on rovers on Mars right now, so it's like that's very sad.
Yeah, that's very true. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, John.
Thanks, Abdulrahman.
Thanks.
The next question comes from Dara, and she asked me to ask her question again. So let me pull it up. Are you aware of any tech-focused organizations or groups in Arab countries? I know about Manara working on leveling up Arab tech talent, but anything else? Yeah, there are tons.
I've been in America for over a decade, so I'm not as plugged into things on the ground back home in the Middle East like that, unfortunately. So I wouldn't be the right person to ask.
Yeah. Okay, great. Now we have two. I think these will be our last two questions. Majdi, let me ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Nasser, thank you. I joined in the call a bit late. I'm a fellow nerd, software engineering. I have a question/comment. So, and I empathize with the dichotomy of language, both human language and software. I'm curious if you see a possibility of almost solving the puzzle by combining it. So I see there is a powerful place for functional languages to actually take human languages form while allowing and not wasting energy, even for that matter, on what I call as the underpinnings, the structural, the objective, and the stuff that's behind the stuff. And the reason I'm proposing that is I am seeing an actual shift towards high-level languages as a method to programming, period. Even if you spoke English. So I'm seeing actually less need. It's becoming more of a commodity for the underpinning language when you abstract it and then go dialect. I think the Chinese have done a better job than any other culture in cleverly and with real focus bringing that to the surface. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so a key observation, I think, for me in the Qalb project is what really culturally cites programming is the requirement to use names that other people have chosen. So a more equitable, for political reasons, a more equitable programming experience would have to have no names. Similarly, people have made the same observation for totally different reasons in the functional programming community, where if you're naming things, it makes it harder to do distributed programming. So there are models of distributed programming. There's a programming language called Unison, and like not to turn this into like an overly technical talk, but there's a programming language called Unison where functions don't canonically have names in the same way that programming languages commonly do. But that's not for political or cultural reasons. That's just to like aid this like higher level goal of distributed computing. So I do think that there's a way to sort of combine, I mean, like you're saying, functional theory and my own sort of political goals of like a programming language that doesn't force everyone to learn English. I think without a technical feature like that, non-English, like English speakers will just not adopt it because it just wouldn't be a reason for them to give up their conveniences.
Thank you.
Okay, great. The last question is sort of a clarification. Ahmad asked me to read it for him. And it was basically, what is the name of the language that, what was this language called, the lingua franca that emerged in the port cities? Do you know?
Lingua Franca.
Oh, that's the name of it.
That's literally, yeah. If you look it up, in addition to that just being a phrase, that is a term that that linguists use for it. Because it was like it's just basically like a foreign language to everyone. It was like a second language to everyone. But yeah, there's a pretty solid Wikipedia article with good references on the lingua franca.
Cool. Okay, great. Just real quick, I've put 2 links in the chat. The first is a feedback link. Was this good? It's literally one question. Let us know. The second is a link to help support Afikra's work. Everything we do is free and open to all. If you'd like our work to keep going and keep growing, consider becoming one of our monthly supporters. That's in the chat as well. And here are a bunch of links to find Ramsey's work all over the place. Ramsey, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, really, really fun. Last question, just sort of off the record. Who should we invite as recommendations from your vantage point? Other friendly nerds that you know or don't know, that you're like, oh my God, that would be so much fun. I'd love to hear from them.
There is a writer who I've followed for years named Salahuddin Ahmad, who's grew up in Detroit, but is of Lebanese descent. And he's a wonderful person. I know him through Twitter. He wrote a novel called Throne of the Crescent Moon, which is a sort of like sword and sandal like adventure novel, but like set in a very Middle Eastern inspired world, which is like not like anything I'd ever read before. And now he does like comics at Marvel. And I think he's introducing the first Marvel character of Lebanese descent, who's like a kid in Detroit who uses the like ayin to do like magical things. So he's a super interesting person. He's absolutely wonderful. I could send you a link to his stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Okay, everybody, have a great day. We've hit the hour. This was really, really fun. Ramsey, thanks so much for doing this. And we have another talk on Thursday with Isabella Hamad, a novelist who just published, I think, last year, a really critically acclaimed novel called The Parisian. And then on Saturday, we have another one of our Meza events. And by the way, Ramsey, you might not know this, at our last Meza event on Saturday, we featured 4 high school students from the American School of Ramallah. I think Khalil might still be on the call. And cool. He presented about Qalb.
Oh my God, that means the world to me.
Yeah. Khalil, are you still there? Raise your hand if you're there. Is that still you? You might not be here. But I'll send you the YouTube video. He brought it up. We didn't push it at all, and he was like, "Oh, I want to present about this programming language," and he did such a good job.
That's wonderful. I mean, I made it for kids like that back home. I made it for myself back home, basically, and like kids like that, exactly. So that's very moving. Thank you for telling me about that.
Yeah, it was really nice. I'll send you the YouTube video. It was awesome. Okay, everybody, much love. Be who you are. See you later.